Let's get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this third and final webinar in this series that we're doing on the green status of species. I'm Moni Böhm. I'm the Freshwater Conservation Coordinator here at the Global Center for Species Survival at the Indianapolis Zoo, which is a partnership between the Indianapolis Zoo and the IUCN Species Survival Commission. I see there's still some people filing in for this final session. It's my great pleasure to introduce today. You're going to get a double whammy today because both Molly and Magda will be presenting today on the role of SIS in green status assessments. But before I hand over, can we just do a few housekeeping notes? Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We always like to see where everybody is joining us from. And also, if you have any questions for Molly and Magda, please share them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And then at the end of their presentation, we'll read out your questions to both speakers and hopefully get as many addressed as possible. So without much further ado, I hand over, I think, to Molly first to kick us off. Over to you, Molly.
Thanks very much, Moni. Hopefully everyone can see my screen that I'm sharing now. But welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're coming from, to our third and final webinar in this Green Status of Species series. Thanks very much to the Global Center for Species Survival for hosting us for these webinars. As Moni said, today, both myself and Magda will be presenting, and we'll be talking about some of the more technical details of the assessment. So if you've made it this far, you're going to learn all of our secrets today and all of the things that will help make the assessment process that much easier for you as you are going through. So we are going to be focusing today. I'm going to speak first about uncertainty in assessments and how you can deal with that in a robust way. And then I'm going to hand over to Magda to talk about the new Green Status SIS module. And if you're not sure what SIS is now, you will certainly know by the time Magda's done speaking. So without further ado, in this session, we're going to have a very brief refresher about what the green status is. I know some people might not have been able to attend the first two webinars, but I promise this will be quite brief just to make sure everyone's on the same page. Then I'll talk about dealing with uncertainty in assessments and then hand over to Magda for a tour of SIS before we have time for some Q&A. So first of all, green status refresher. So what is the green status of species? As many of you probably know, this is an expansion of the Red List of Threatened Species applicable to all fungi, plants, and animals. And so when you go to the Red List website, you will now see not just the familiar extinction risk category of a species, but also new metrics, new green status metrics that I'll briefly describe now. So the Green Status of Species assessment has two main aims. The first is to provide a standardized framework for measuring species recovery, and the second is to assess the impact of and incentivize conservation action. So I'll briefly describe how the Green Status measures that first aim. So the Green Status defines a fully recovered species. So this is the first global standardized assessment of what it means for a species to recover. So a fully recovered species is viable and ecologically functional in each part of its indigenous range. And this might seem quite ambitious, but really this is just a standardized benchmark that we can use to compare recovery status between species. We don't necessarily expect that every single species is going to be able to reach or meet this definition. So in our green status assessment, that definition of a fully recovered species is translated into a score that ranges from 0 to 100%, where 100% represents a species that is fully recovered, so meeting that definition. And then you travel away from 100%, we go through different categories. So just like the Red List has extinction risk categories, this new addition to the Red List, the Green Status of Species, has species recovery categories. So between 80 and 100% score, we have a slightly depleted species. The next category is a moderately depleted species, largely depleted, critically depleted, and then finally, if a species has a score of 0%, that means it's extinct or extinct in the wild. And so what's really great about the green status is that this new recovery score and accompanying category complement the red list category. So you could have a species that's least concern on the red list, but actually when it comes to species recovery and recovering viable and functional populations across the range, there might be a bit more work for conservation to do. And that's what the green status captures. So a little bit more detail on how we do that, and that's going to become important for when I talk about uncertainty. So all of these different elements, these different steps of the assessment have uncertainty associated with them, and we're going to discuss how to deal with that uncertainty as part of the webinar today. So the first step is to define the indigenous range of the species. That was a term mentioned in that definition of a fully recovered species. And so the indigenous range is the current range of the species and the range that it occupied prior to major human impacts. You can see an example of this for a UK-based species on the diagram here. The next step in the green status process is to divide that range into spatial units. So divisions of that range that we are going to use in a later part of the assessment. You can see an example of that on the diagram as well. And these spatial units are meant to represent relevant divisions of the species. So they can be based on the species biology, ecology, anthropogenic borders or locations of threat, or even grid cells, but just dividing that range into separate pieces that we can use to assess the state of the species across the range. The next step is once we have those spatial units, those parts of the range, the next step in the assessment is to assess the state in each spatial unit. So there are 4 possible states that you can assign to a spatial unit: absent, present, viable, and functional, increasing in the value of the state. So we want functional populations, we don't want absent populations in spatial units. And the assessments of these states are based primarily or in large part on red list category. So assessing the regional red list status within the spatial unit. So if you have a threatened red list category within the spatial unit, you are not going to have a viable species. Once the species is no longer at a level of threat in the spatial unit, then you have to think about, is the species simply viable, so not under threat, or is it viable but also performing its ecological roles, interactions, and functions? And so that is an area of uncertainty that we're going to talk about today. And then finally, once you've decided what each of the states in the spatial unit should be, absent, present, viable, or functional, this combines to give a species recovery score. So again, ranging from 0 to 100%, where 0% represents an extinct in the wild or extinct species where all of those spatial units are absent, and 100% represents a fully recovered species where all of those spatial units are functional. And so in our example, you can see that most of our spatial units within the indigenous range are absent. 1 is occupied and it's viable, and there is a mathematical equation that gives you that percentage from 0 to 100%. In the case of our species, its species recovery score is 10%. So if we think about that in the context of our categories, that's going to be a critically depleted species. And that makes sense, right? It's absent from most of its indigenous range. It makes sense that we would call it critically depleted relative to that baseline. That was my very quick recap of the first aim of the green status. How does the green status of species assessment measure recovery in a standardized way? Very briefly, the green status also has a second aim, which is assessing the impact of and incentivizing conservation action. And you'll recall from the previous webinars that the way it does this is assessors can choose to assess not just the current category, the current states of the species to get the current green score or species recovery score. They can actually assess what that score would be under different scenarios, past and future, with conservation and without conservation. So the assessor could assess what the current state of the species would be today if no conservation action had taken place in the past, and the difference between what we actually observe and this hypothetical or scenario-based estimate gives us a measure called the conservation legacy. So looking at the impact that past conservation has had on the species, making that sometimes invisible work of conservation visible. So have we prevented declines or further declines in the species. Assessors can also choose to assess what they expect will happen to the score within the next 10 years if all conservation actions stopped. And that gives you a metric called the conservation dependence. They can also assess what the expected impact of ongoing and planned conservation action will be within the next 10 years. This gives a reportable metric called conservation gain. And finally, we have the recovery potential. So over the next 100 years, if everything went right, if we did not have limits of funding, what could we achieve for that species? Where could it be reintroduced? Where could habitat be restored? This is a metric that's not ignoring reality. So we have to think about the life history of the species, what areas of the indigenous range actually could be made suitable for a species, even with our best efforts, because obviously if a city has been built over parts of the range, we might not be able to reintroduce a species there, but it gives us the space in which conservation can work. So those are the 4 conservation impact metrics of the green status assessment. And this is an example I showed last time, but just like with the current recovery score that gets assigned to a category, these conservation impact metrics are also assigned a category for easy communication. And this is a real example that you can view on the Red List website right now. So hopefully we're all back up to speed with what is required for a green status assessment, but how do you actually go about doing it? Last webinar, we talked about sources of information that you can use. So I recommend you go back and have a look at that webinar, which is available online as well for you to look at. But even if you know where you're going to get your information, that information might not always be perfect. There might be uncertainty associated with it. And we're here to reassure you today that that does not necessarily prevent you from doing an assessment. So we're going to talk about some common sources of uncertainty in the assessment and how you might be able to deal with that uncertainty and still produce a robust, defensible green status assessment. So as I mentioned, I'm going to go through those different steps of the assessment and talk about some of the points of uncertainty. So the first area of uncertainty that you might encounter is in the first step of the assessment. So defining the indigenous range. This might not be exactly known. For many species, the distribution of the species prior to major human impacts is not precisely mapped. There might not be complete or perfect information about where that species occurred historically, and that is okay. If you think about it, if you look at red list distribution maps of current range, these are not always precise. You might not have every occurrence of a species included. Sometimes you might have very few occurrence points, and yet we still generate red list distribution maps to the best of our ability. And so that's a similar thing with the green status assessment as well. You don't need to have a perfect map of where the species indigenous range is in order to do the assessment. If you're trying to think about where do I even start thinking about the indigenous range of a species, you might think about this question, which is, are there extirpated spatial units that need to be included in this assessment? Because you might know that the distribution was bigger in the past, you don't know exactly how much. But if you think about the assessment, really, we're looking at the status in each of these different spatial units, and that's what's combined to give that final score, that recovery score. And so if you can think about what spatial unit should I be using, maybe there's some that existed in the past that I need to include, and I can map those in different ways. So if you are really unsure about the indigenous range, you might first think about the current range of the species. Looking at the current range of the species, what spatial units make sense for that species? So again, listed on this screen are different ways that you could think about spatial units. I've highlighted the first one, which is the preferred option if you can do it for your species, which is thinking about spatial units based on biology, whether that's subspecies or subpopulations. And so you might have an example where currently there are 2 extant subspecies of the species that you're assessing, and you have good maps for those. You know through historical records that there were 3 subspecies that used to exist but are now extinct, and you might not have exact maps of where those species are. So in your assessment, you could use 5 spatial units and indicate on your map to the best of your ability, based on current knowledge, where those other 3 subspecies were distributed. And if you get new information or new information that comes to light through the research process, in future reassessments of the species, you can revise that map, right? So don't let imperfect information stop you from doing an assessment. An example of this, of how you might be able to map spatial units where you don't have perfect information, is you could map known locations, as this example map is done, and infer spatial unit boundaries. And again, this can always be updated. I do have to point out that while I love this map as an example, it was not created for a green status assessment. It's purely used to illustrate how you might have some uncertainties in your mapping, but be able to turn that into something you could submit. And then perhaps you don't have any biologically based divisions of your species, so there's no real known subspecies or subpopulations. Perhaps you want to think about ecologically based spatial units. How could you use that sort of information to create a map of indigenous range for your species? Well, I'm going to use a real example that has been published on the Red List website. Its green status assessment has been published. So we have a species here. Its current distribution is shown in purple. This is a bird species native to the US. And there was some uncertainty about where it was distributed in the past. The assessors knew that the past range was bigger. They knew that in the past, the range of this species was mostly contiguous, so sort of joined up, one continuous range for the species, but the exact extent of that range was not known. So when they were thinking about how they might divide this, because it was a continuous range, there weren't really any subspecies or subpopulation genetic divisions that they could use as spatial units. So instead, they started thinking about relevant ecological divisions, which I've put on this map. Then they went to the literature. They found current and historical records of the species going back to 1500. Now, this was obviously not a complete historical record. Not every observation of the species has been recorded, but it gives you an idea of where to start. Then, of course, they went through a process of checking and cleaning the records, making sure they were, confirmed records, that they were in locations that made sense. And then once they'd gone through that process, they looked at the ecological regions that they'd identified that contained those records. And based on that, they mapped their indigenous range. So, we might not be able to say with 100% confidence that the species was found in every single corner of all of these ecological regions, but we have pretty good historical evidence, and this is the best map that we can make at the time. So this is an acceptable way to do your mapping for the green status. It's an acceptable way to think about the indigenous range for the green status assessment process. Okay, so that was thinking about uncertainty within the indigenous range. Maybe with a pretty good degree of certainty what the historical range of the species was, but you might be wondering, how do I divide this range into spatial units? Now, again, we have these suggested ways of doing it, from most preferred to least preferred, but different approaches might be more or less relevant for your species. I will say that while we include grid cells, this is very much a last resort if there's literally no other way to divide your species up. And this does happen. We have had assessments where this has been required for various reasons, but in general, it's better to think about a division that is relevant from a biological or conservation perspective for the species. So biological units are, again, our preferred way of thinking about it. So start with that. And this is because biological units like subspecies, varieties, races, or subpopulations, any sort of biological division you can imagine, can convey variation and evolutionary potential that is important to conserve. So when we're thinking about, are we recovering the species? Are we recovering it across the range? Are we recovering it functionally across the range? Thinking about this variation and evolutionary potential is an important component of that. And so again, this is a map that was not created for a green status assessment, but I think it shows the points I'd like to make very well. So we have two subspecies of this oak species, this quercus species, and those are mapped here. You can see that there's a bit of uncertainty in the exact borders of where one subspecies ends and another subspecies begins. This is a very common thing. So don't worry about that if you are using subspecies for your spatial units in a green status assessment. We like putting taxa in boxes, but they don't like to stay in their boxes. So that is absolutely fine. But these biological divisions can be a useful way to think about variation within the species, so they make very good spatial units. And maybe there aren't named subspecies or races or subpopulations, but often within a species, there will be biogeographic divisions that can serve as a proxy for these biological divisions. So for example, this is an assessment in PrEP, the Gharial green status assessment, where there aren't named subspecies or subpopulations of Gharial, but they are freshwater species that exist in different hydrobasins. There's little evidence of dispersal between these different hydrobasins, and so we can think of what's happening within each hydrobasin as kind of being independent of the others. That's not to say that there's no dispersal or no connectivity. That's not a prerequisite for any spatial units, by the way. There can be connectivity between spatial units, but thinking about, is the status in one spatial unit going to be sort of evolving independently of what's happening in another spatial unit? So these biogeographic divisions can be a good proxy for spatial units as well. And then finally, we have suggested that you can also think about spatial units based on ecology or anthropogenic borders or locations. These are very useful ways, in many cases, to think about spatial units. Just to make you aware of some potential pitfalls in using these two methods. So the great thing about anthropogenic borders and in many cases ecoregions is that they are mapped. And so it would be quite easy to go into GIS or QGIS, put your species distribution, and then overlay it with country borders or with ecoregion borders, and just say, okay, anything that touches this species distribution is a spatial unit. The one thing that can be a bit of a pitfall about that is that you have sort of marginal regions. So for example, this is an entirely made up example in this map, but we have in green a species distribution. And countries could be a good way to think about spatial units for this species. But you'll notice that it has a little bit of a distribution in Italy, but very, very small. And so if we were to treat this to Italy as a separate spatial unit for this species, it wouldn't be representative, it wouldn't be accurate. And so what we recommend that you do in cases like that is that you combine it in with another spatial unit. So recognizing that, yes, the distribution extends into this area, but it's not a full independent spatial unit on its own. And we actually have published a paper talking about cases like this and other considerations to make when you are choosing your spatial units, which you can see the information for that paper in the citation just down the bottom. So once you've got your indigenous range, once you've got your spatial units, you have to decide what is the state in each of these spatial units. So again, there are 4 possible states, and these states are based on primarily red list criteria. So the issue with this can be, obviously, there is imperfect information. So even if we're looking at the current state of a species, we might have a population estimate, for example, there will be uncertainty associated with that estimate. So the population could be as high as 5,000 individuals, but it could be as low as, I don't know, 1,000, and we have a best estimate of 2,000. So how do we deal with uncertainties in that type of information as we are assessing the state of each spatial unit? So one thing that will put your mind at ease, hopefully, is that the assessment does account for this uncertainty. So this is an example on the Red List website right now. It is the Vicuña Green Status Assessment. And we're looking at just one of its spatial units under the different scenarios that I talked about. So the current state and then different scenarios with and without conservation in the past and future. And for every scenario, for every spatial unit, assessors report a best estimate. So this is based on the balance of the evidence. This is the most supported state that we are going to assign for this spatial unit. But if there is any uncertainty, assessors also give a minimum and a maximum state for each spatial unit under each scenario. So actually in the vicuña, there was some uncertainty for all of these different scenarios. So for example, you know, without conservation today, the assessors inferred that the species would most likely be absent in this spatial unit, but it's possible that a few individuals would have remained, and so the maximum state is present. And that sort of information is captured in these minimum, best, and maximum states, and also in the justifications that assessors give for each of these pieces of information. And this uncertainty is also captured in that recovery score. So I've shown just a very basic understanding of how that score is reported. So again, we have a score that ranges from 0 to 100, where 0 equals all the spatial units are absent, and 100 means that all the spatial units are functional. And so if we look at our example species on the right here in this figure, we have a species recovery score of 10%. But that's just based on the best estimates for all of those spatial units. For example, if we were to look at the minimum score, we would see that actually while the best score for this spatial unit is viable, due to uncertainty in our data, it's possible that that spatial unit is only considered present. And so this allows us to calculate another species recovery score, which is 5%. This is the minimum possible species recovery score reported for that species. And of course, we also do the maximum. So 2 of these spatial units that were absent on our best case, our best estimate, thinking about the uncertainty in the data tell us that it's possible that there might be a few individuals that just haven't been captured by survey effort in these spatial units. And so that gives us a new maximum score of 19%. So when we report the results of the assessment for this species, we give the best score, 10%, but we also report that uncertainty. And that is reported on the website, and people can evaluate for themselves, okay, what is, taking into account this uncertainty, now how do I interpret the assessment? And then thinking of this, this is just an example of that for the vicuña as well. So you can see that its best score is 67%, which places it in the moderately depleted category, but there is considerable uncertainty around that score. So that is reported in the assessment on the Red List website. And then thinking about these conservation impact metrics, so legacy, dependence, gain, and recovery potential, obviously, in this sort of cartoon figure, we're just showing the best estimates in each of these points. But just like for the current score, there would be some variation in the possible values of each of those scores under each of those different scenarios. And so that is reflected in the calculation of these metrics as well. So if we look at the vicuña's example online, we can see that for each of our metrics, legacy, dependence, gain, and recovery potential, there is a category reported, a best score, and a minimum and a maximum as well. So all this information is there. It's not hidden from anyone. So hopefully this will help you. If you want to do an assessment, you won't feel that that you're simplifying the story or hiding things, because all that information is out there for anyone to evaluate. So the last bit from me is that if you want to further reduce your uncertainty, you can do so through training. All of the things that I've talked about are part of our online training course. I talked more about this last week, so I'm just going to mention it briefly here. But you can use this link, which I think Coralie will put in the chat, or use the QR code on the screen to sign up for that training course. And I highly recommend you do that if you are interested in learning more about the assessment process. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to hand over to Magda for the next part of our webinar.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for that, Molly. Let me just share my screen. Okay, I hope everyone can see that. Okay, so now I'm just going to talk to you guys a little bit about the new green status module in SIS. Just for anyone that's unfamiliar with SIS, I'm going to take a quick moment to explain exactly what SIS is. So as you can see here, it stands for Species Information Service, and in short, it's IUCN's central database for storing and managing assessments that get published on the Red List. And the intended users are anyone involved in a Red List or Green Status assessment. So ordinarily, that would include specialist group members, Red List authority coordinators, Red List partners, and relevant IUCN secretariat like myself. So just to give a sort of quick overview of the workflow in SIS, basically all species that undergo assessments have an SIS account, and the assessors input assessment data into that species account. And then after that, reviews, editing, and checks all happen within SIS. And then finally, when it's time to publish the assessment, the data is pulled from SIS onto the Red List website in an automated process. SIS has a number of really useful features that make it a good platform to use. First, it provides a standardized data format which ensures consistency, simplicity, and also taxonomic integrity when conducting assessments. It captures comments, references, and edit history, and this keeps the assessment process transparent and also facilitates evaluation of the evolving assessment. It automatically calculates the green score, category, and conservation impact metrics, and again, this ensures consistent application of the methodology and also just simplifies the process for everyone involved. And finally, as an online web application, it allows experts to collaborate remotely and provide secure storage of assessment information. So just to show you the sort of before and after, if any of you have been involved before in a green status assessment, you'll be familiar with the Google Sheets workbooks that we've been using. And they've been good, they've served their purpose, but to be honest, they're not super intuitive to navigate and maybe a little bit of a headache to look at. So we're really, really excited about the launch of the new SIS module for the green status, which should be sometime around next week. All that needs to happen is for me and Molly and our team to give it one final check, and then it will go live. So stay tuned. And it's just got a much nicer interface, and it's an interface that our assessor base is familiar with and will hopefully be a lot more comfortable using. Okay, so let's just take a closer look. Okay, so just to be super clear, at the moment, I'm in a demo version of SIS. So the features I'm about to show you are not available in real SIS yet, but like I said, they will be really soon. So if we navigate to the species account that I'm going to show you, this is a sort of half complete assessment just to show you as an example and talk you through the features. So don't worry about what's been written there and the fact that it's incomplete for the time being. Okay, so at the moment, we're in the section on range. So you've got a field to put in your benchmark year, the year that major human impacts started. And then you've got a field to write down the indigenous range narrative. So things like describing the indigenous range, justifying the benchmark year, and explaining how the indigenous range has changed since the benchmark year. Next, you've got a bit to say yes or no. Is there going to be any expected additional range? So that's the range in the next 100 years. And then a field to justify why you think there will or won't be expected additional range. So next, let's navigate to the spatial unit section. So again, you've got a sort of drop-down arrow to select which type of delineation method you used for your species, which Molly has discussed already. And then a field to justify why this was an appropriate delineation method for your species. And then we've got a little section on generation length here. And it was included here because some of the state criteria are linked to generation length. So for example, you might be looking at a reduction over 3 generations. That's one of the red list criteria. And having that here just makes it easier for the reviewer to check that the appropriate states have been chosen. So here you've got an option to change to a finer resolution version of the assessment. I don't think this has been discussed in the webinars yet, but basically it's just if you've got a very, very small number of spatial units in your assessment, we recommend using a finer resolution version of assessing the states. And that's just to sort of boost the resolution a bit, because having a small number of spatial units will reduce the resolution. So that's all that is. And here is where you add all the information about your spatial units. So let's just view. So at the moment, there's only one spatial unit that's been added for this species. So you have a field to add the spatial unit name, whether it's indigenous or expected additional range, and then an optional short description of the spatial units, and of course, the scenarios. So the current state, the former state, current without conservation, future with conservation, future without conservation, and long-term aspiration. So I'll return to this in a second, because I want to show you how your inputs here will affect the other sections. But for now, let's just leave. Okay, so now the species functionality field. This is where you add functions for your species. So let's just say we want, so here are the existing functions that have been added for this species. If we want to add a new one, you press add here, stipulate what type of function it is. Let's just say it's structural, and then write about that structural function, what it is. And then it will be added. And here, the functionality narrative field is where you describe the indicator or threshold for a functional spatial unit of your species. This bit, the green status assessment, is where all the metrics and categories are automatically calculated. So for this species, the best estimate for the species recovery score is 100%, which obviously equates to fully recovered. So obviously, at the moment, it's showing 100% and fully recovered because only one spatial unit has been added, and that spatial unit is functional. So that equates to 100%. But let's just say you wanted to add another spatial unit. You do it like this, press add. Let's just call it southern. Say it's indigenous range. And then maybe in this spatial unit, it's not functional. Maybe it's only present with an upper bound of viable. So once we've done that, when we press save, you should see that the calculated species recovery score changes here. There we go. So now it's moderately depleted. And if we go back to the green status assessment, you'll see that the recovery score has gone down to 67%. So you'll see at the moment that all the conservation impact metrics are not filled in, and that's because none of the scenarios have been filled in yet. So let me show you what happens if you do fill in some of the scenarios. So let's just say in the future without conservation scenario, the species goes extinct. So the species is really dependent on continued conservation efforts. Might not be true for this species, by the way. This is just an example to show you guys how the calculation works. Future without conservation, absent in both spatial units. So now, if I click Save and navigate back to the assessment, the dependence section has been filled in. So the conservation dependence is high because, like I showed you, without conservation, this species would go extinct. And if you fill in all the scenarios, then all of these ones would be filled in as well. And here you've just got a field to put a sort of broad overview of the assessment and the results. So just to show you this in a published assessment. Oh, no. Sorry. There we go. There we go. So it's in the green status assessment information section. It's just this paragraph here. So it's just the rationale for why your species recovery score and category and conservation impact metrics are the way they are. So anyone looking at this assessment that doesn't want to read the whole thing could just consult this section. Back to SIS. Not sure why. I'm not sure why that bit has collapsed into a tiny area, but the last bit I wanted to show you was just a credits section where you put the name of the authors, contributors, and institutions that were involved. So that's it from me with regards to SIS. So I think now we're going to open the floor for any questions that people have.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. It's nice to see the whole green status coming into SIS and actually being more than just the, well, the very early assessment approach with like spreadsheets and stuff, which is really, really cool. Have we got any questions for Molly and Magda?
I don't currently have any open questions in the Q&A.
It seems that the module that was set up in SIS is actually pretty straightforward because it seems a lot less big in scope as the red list module is. How long? I don't even know how to phrase this question. Has there been a lot of testing going into how well this works and how user-friendly it is, or will you still take feedback from folks? Because I feel whenever something new gets introduced, there's always a lot of opinions about it. That's technically what I'm asking.
Yeah, good point. Well, it still has to just go through final testing of sort of all our team, and there might be changes based on that. After it goes live, I think there probably will be opportunities for feedback from users. And then when SIS is sort of updated in the future, then there will be changes made. I know that there's a fully new interface of SIS coming. So that might be the time that we make those changes.
So far, nobody has any questions. I can only assume that everybody is already scribbling down their green status assessment so that as soon as SIS goes live for that, they just have to transfer the information and you'll have another 50 assessments or so. This is how I interpret this.
Yeah, it was a very thorough presentation too. So I think you answered a lot of questions during the talk.
So for anybody who hasn't been in the previous 2 webinars or hasn't had the chance yet to look at the videos, can you just quickly repeat the kind of support that's available, where they can find it apart from the red list training?
Yeah, it's a great idea.
Your email addresses.
Yeah.
Yes, well, we can I can share a screen that has our email addresses online, but so there's many types of support available, as Moni mentioned, and I briefly mentioned. We have our online training course. There is information available on the Red List website. So if you go to the Red List website and go to the About section, there's an entire green status of species, a few pages there that show a very brief overview, has some useful links. It has links to the assessment instructions and guidance as well. Let's see. So Magda is based in the Red List units and works full-time on processing and supporting green status assessments. So if you have any questions about, sort of general inquiries or the assessment process, or you want some training, she would be a great person to get in touch with. I will actually just share the screen so you can see our email addresses. Flip through Magda's slides. Oops. Nope. Went too far. Let's do it better this time. There we go. So yes, Magda's a great person to get in touch with about general queries. As I mentioned in the last webinar, I co-chair the working group along with Barney Long based at Rewild, and we are very happy to support strategic planning and funding opportunities. So in the last webinar, I mentioned a number of ways that you can get funding to do green status assessments. I'm very happy to have a chat with you about how much workshops or assessments would cost. Speaking of workshops, we also can host either online or in-person training workshops for your group. So get in touch with either Magda or I to talk about that possibility.
Amazing. And that gave enough time for questions to come in. To kick us off, the choice of spatial unit can be done in several ways, as you said, but when working in the same group, such as birds, is it better to keep the same choice or always think individually species by species?
That's a good question. I'll start and then I'll let you weigh in as well, Magda. I think in general, if you're working with within a taxon and species have similar life history and sort of like current situation, it can be very useful to think about using the same sort of spatial units across species. I think that's always a good first instinct. There might be certain cases where you find that that doesn't work, perhaps just due to the quirks of a particular species or its particular situation. So we're not inflexible in that way, but I think the instinct to use similar techniques for delineating spatial units for related taxa is a good one. And if you look at the paper that Coralie very kindly linked in the chat, we did a bit of a exploration of if you divide the range into spatial units in different ways, does that massively change the score? And if you do it in sort of a logical way, in a reasonable way, it shouldn't. But that's further explored in the paper. Happy to chat more about that. But Magda, what's your take on using similar types of spatial units for similar species?
I agree on everything you said there. To be honest, Molly, I don't have too much to add. I would say if the species have sort of closely related and have similar threats in a similar situation in a similar part of the world, then I would recommend using the same spatial units, but it definitely doesn't have to be. Whatever makes the most sense for your species.
Perfect. Okay, and we have another question. Regarding the level of hydrobasins, the best magnitude is level 7 or 5, or what makes sense for the species?
I think this was a question based on the gharial example I showed earlier, where you can use biogeographical barriers as proxies for biological spatial units. So I was showing different hydrobasins that were used as spatial units for the gharial assessment. And the assessors determined that hydrobasin level, I think it was level 7 in the example, was best for the species. So if you're not a freshwater ecologist, the hydrobasins have different levels of delineation where you're lumping or splitting them based on the scale. So hydrobasin level 5 would either be larger or smaller groups than the one that I showed. We're not recommending hydrobasin level 7 as the way to do spatial units. It was just what made sense for that species. So thinking about biogeographical divisions that are relevant for the species that you're considering is always the best way to go.
Yeah, bearing in mind that the sort of upper limit that we generally say for the number of spatial units is 20. So if you use a sort of hydrobasin level that's too small, you might get way more than 20. So you should then use a higher level of hydrobasin, if you see what I mean. So it's considerations about what is most appropriate for the species, but also what is most appropriate in the context of a green status assessment, where the primary purpose is communication, and we want to keep things simple enough for people to understand.
Absolutely.
And that for now are all the questions. Another very clear presentation. Of course, I feel there's probably going to be many more questions coming up as soon as the green status module in SIS is getting released. You can see the email addresses for Magda and Molly on the screen, and they're great at getting back with advice on any of your questions. Well, any of your questions about the green status assessments. Let's be a bit more specific. There's no new questions popping up. Just as a quick reminder, Molly, Magda, when can we expect to see this green status module in SIS?
So I don't have an exact date just yet, but we're hoping in the next week or so. Like I said, all that needs to happen is for me and Molly and our team to sort of check it once through, make sure that everything is all good, and then it will go live. So yeah, very soon.
Excellent. Obviously, the reason that, you know, it's not live yet is because we're bogging you down with webinars. That's clearly what's happened here. Okay. No, that's great. I kind of expected, I don't know, an answer of like in 2 months, but that's like much more imminent than I thought. So that's great.
And yeah, we definitely encourage people to interact with SIS, with the new module. And if you do have questions or comments, please do get in touch with us, because the hope with the SIS module is that we'll make the assessment process much more streamlined and straightforward for everyone.
No, it looks like it's been set up really, really intuitive, which I quite like. So that's great. Okay. Since there's no more questions, we'll let everybody enjoy the rest of their days. Thank you so much, Molly and Magda, for a really awesome webinar series. We'll upload this video as well to our YouTube channel, and then we'll also, for anybody with an SSC affiliation, we'll also post these through from the Species Survival Commission's one-stop shop, and obviously share the results with everybody who registered as well, and via social media. So keep sharing so we get many more green status assessments in future. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody.